this episode of Digging In. Digging In is basically it's a Bible study. We look at a passage here that we'll be focusing on in our worship service here at Sunny Slope, but I get to take you here a little bit into the details of a text, and so we get to kind of walk through and in the process we get to practice doing a Bible study, and along the way we kind of learn some of the proper ways and the best ways to study a Bible passage so that you can then take these ideas and practice them in your own personal Bible study. We are going to be starting a new series here in the fall. We're going to be looking at the minor prophets. Now there's 12 minor prophets, and if we were to do every chapter in every book, it would take us probably a couple of years or at least a year to do it. And so we're not going to do that. We're going to look at one chapter from each of the 12 minor prophets. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose one chapter that I think is probably the best representation of what that particular book is all about. That's a little hard to do, and it's not a perfect science, but we're gonna do the best that we can with that. And we're starting with the book of Hosea. And I've chosen Hosea chapter 1 because I think it brings out at least two of the main themes that are found throughout the book. So let's get started. I'm going to put the book up on, or the text up on the screen so that you can see it. And our first goal is to lay out the text in a way that helps us kind of follow the logical flow of the passage. And so we're not looking in real depth or detail at the words or the literary tools that are being used or the grammatical parts of the text just yet. We first want to break the text down so that we can follow its order. So here we go. And I use Logos to do this. You can do this. It's a little harder probably, but you could probably do it in like Microsoft Word if you wanted to. Essentially, for every line, we're looking for one verb, one little phrase. So that helps us. That's maybe a good way to do it. One verb per line. So we start off, the word of the Lord came to Hosea. And then I also like to kind of, when there are modifying clauses, I like to put those underneath to kind of show the relationship to the main clause. So Hosea is the son of Beri in the day, and the word of the Lord came in the days of Uzziah. And then it also gives us a number of additional kings here. So again, I like to put those down. It just helps me kind of follow the relationship of these clauses to the main idea here. Um, and then you can see again, and in the days of Jeroboam. So this helps you see these are the kings of Judah, and then the kings and in the days of Jeroboam. Whoops, like this, the son of Joash, king of Israel. So that just helps us locate the text in terms of chronology and history. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, we're going to bring this. The Lord said to Hosea, so this is, and then when we have the quote, we bring that down another line. Go. And since this is an imperative here, the word go is an imperative, and then the word take to yourself is a separate clause. It's really a repeated clause, but we're going to just put those on separate lines. Take to yourself a wife of whoredom. Well, that's quite, I mean, you imagine what that quiet time must have been like for Hosea when he's trying to listen to what God might have to say to him. Um, take to yourself and so have children of whoredom. Okay, this is getting better by the moment here. This is quite a story for the land. And then this is now a purpose clause. So the word for indicates a reason or purpose for the land. And then so I want to, because I want to keep these words all kind of lined up. This is what God says to Hosea. Now the purpose, the land commits great whoredom. So what I'm going to do just to um, kind of help things stay consistent is something like this. So I can see the idea of whoredom is consistent. It's what Hosea is doing, and now God explains it's for what the land is doing. How are they doing it? They commit it by forsaking the Lord. We're back to a narrative portion again. So he went and we're going to put went and took because that matches up with go and take. So it's just emphasizing that idea of obedience. When the same word is given in the command followed by the obedience, that just is a way of saying instructions were followed exactly. And he took, we can keep this up here, Gomer. And who is Gomer? Well, the daughter of Diablum. He went and took, and she conceived and bore him a son. And again, now the Lord's giving instructions, and the Lord said to him, that is to Hosea. So we'll say, we'll subvert that the command underneath, call his name Jezreel. Now another purpose clause. For in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu. And we're going to stretch this out. Yeah. I need a little more space here, so I like to spread this out. For in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. That's one long sentence. And then we have a second thing that God is doing here. We'll line that up. I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. So again, there's you can see parallel ideas there. The clause is basically an echo. I will punish and put an end to the house and the kingdom. So it kind of emphasizes it's poetically it lines up quite nicely. We keep this still as a quote from God. And on that day, I will break the bow or the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So we'll get the idea of Jezreel there. We don't really know anything about what Jezreel is at this point. So we'll make a note that we're going to come back to that. We want to figure out what is this whole Jezreel thing about. Um, okay. Conceived again, conceived and bore, those two things go together. And now again, and the Lord said to him, call her name no mercy, and then again another purpose, for I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel, and the mercy then to forgive. That's an infinitive. The word to in front of a verb is always an infinitive, and that always has to then go with another verb to forgive them at all. But then there's a second segment here. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah. So we wonder about that. So what is no mercy in the house of Israel and the house of Judah? So if you might be familiar, you might not be. Israel's divided into two kingdoms, and so God's going to deal with each kingdom differently. There's reasons for that, which we'll get into a little bit later. But we notice that God is still showing mercy to the house of Judah. So there's still that's the southern kingdom. There's still hope for the southern kingdom yet. We'll have to unpack that a little bit more later. On the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not. And so we have kind of this, it's all kind of line up. Whoops. I like it to be precise, but sometimes my doesn't want to cooperate. Anyways, I will not save them by the bow. And again, I just like to do it or by sword or by war. I just like to line them up as much as I can. Again, my computer program doesn't always let me line it up as exactly as I'd like, but or by horses or by horsemen. So you can pretty clearly see there's an emphasis here. I will not save them. And then there's this whole long list of the ways that God will not save. And when you get a list like that, that's really for emphasis. When she had weaned, okay, so we're back to narrative. When she'd weaned no mercy, that poor kid, and her name is like ouch. Um, and we're referring again to Gomer, she conceived and bore. So again, conceived and bore often are they're two things that fit together. Um, Sometimes it's called a hendiadys, which is literally a word that means to say one thing two ways. And so it's kind of like sometimes the word heaven and earth is two words, one idea. Conceived and bore, often those things go together in the Bible. And that's just a way of referring to one event. And the Lord said, now we're back to what God gives instructions, call his name, not my people. I mean, these poor kids and their names. Um, and a purpose clause for you are not my people. And so we'll do you and I, we'll kind of set those up. And then we want to do it like this, I think. are, am, not, not. That all just kind of lines up quite nicely, I think. Now, the text ends, we're almost at the end of the text. Yet the number of children, and this is still God speaking, so we should maybe move this over. Yet the number of children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, and that, so which cannot be measured or numbered. So we'll put measured and numbered kind of next to each other. We're at the end of our page here in the computer program. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. So the text it ends with what looks like a real promise. So the whole text is about, these indictments that God is handing down against his people. And there's judgment and there's warning and there's, God's heartache and that. But then the text ends with promise, and it ends with hope because it's still saying that. So the language of, sand on the seashore, children of the living God, that's covenant language that says that God is still faithful to his promise that he made to his people. And so we have to make note of that. That's going to be really, really important. Because then again, and the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Now, we don't really know, for us, um, the language is actually still kind of fuzzy. What does all of that exactly mean? And we don't know that yet. We're not that far along in our study. We've just kind of broken down the text into these parts so that we can try to get a sense of the flow of thought. What are the quotations? How does the text break down? That's going to help us when we go into our next step, which is then to study the individual parts of the text in greater detail, which we'll do next. All right, we are back picking up our study of Hosea chapter 1. We've just finished laying out the text. We've broken it down into really small parts. We've broken it down into individual phrases, and we've tried to look at how does each phrase relate to the one before and after it, and that kind of gives us a sense of the flow of the text. Our next step in doing this is, and our next step in a good Bible study is to go through the text now and pay careful attention to everything we can about the literary and historical and theological content of the text. In other words, we're paying really careful attention to the language that is used in the imagery and the way that words are used and what is all of that trying to get across to us. Remember, when we do a Bible study, our main question is not, what does this text mean to me? In other words, we don't just come to a text and let it say whatever we feel we want it to say. Our main goal is to try to understand first, what does this text mean for the original audience? What was God saying to his people when this text was first written? Once we know that, then we can begin to ask the question, how does this now apply to me? So let me put our text up on the screen. We'll pick it back up where we left off, and we'll begin to make some notes about the text. One of the first things that I notice is that the text starts off with just a historical setting. That might not seem all that important, but it lets us know that Hosea was not just some kind of mythical person. He wasn't just some person that was invented in order. In other words, it's not just a legend or a story, but this is actually a person who we can find his date and place. These are the names of the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. So a little bit of background as we go through the minor prophets. You have to remember that Israel is divided into two kingdoms, and each kingdom goes through its own succession of different kings. And those kings, of course, they change at different times. And so what you'll often find in the minor prophets is the message will tell you who was king in the north and who was king in the south. And that helps you actually narrow down exactly when the books were written. And that's what we find here. Now, so this first part is historical setting. Now, the next part here we can call it Hosea's commission because what God is doing is he's telling Hosea what he needs to do and a little bit of why. Now, I think this is really I don't know how exactly this all goes down, but it must have been a shock because God comes to Hosea and Hosea is having his quiet time one day. He's doing his devotions or whatever, and all of a sudden he gets a word from the Lord. And I don't know if you've ever, received a message like this, but essentially God says to Hosea, I have someone I want you to marry. And, maybe Hosea, young single guy, oh, great, Lord, that sounds good. And the message is you got to marry someone who's promiscuous and she has a lot of partners and she has a history and that's a shocking command and a shocking requirement from God to Hosea. But of course, God has a purpose in that, which is then explained to us here. So go take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom. That, again, that's certainly not a politically correct thing to say these days, but here's the message. For the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. So in other words, the first idea here is that God is reminding his people that his purpose and his relationship that he desired with his people was to be that of husband and wife. He desired that kind of intimacy and that kind of fidelity and exclusivity that normally you would find within a marriage. And that was by telling Hosea to marry this woman, God was saying, ideally, I'd intended to have this marriage relationship, but the people have forsaken that. They have broken down that marriage relationship. So that image of marriage and fidelity becomes a main theme throughout the book of Hosea, this idea of God relating to his people as a spouse. So Hosea does as he's told here, and again, I've pointed this out in other videos, but you see the word here, and then it's often repeated here, and that's just a way of emphasizing the way that a prophet follows obediently to exactly what was commanded. Now, what follows is three successive children. So Hosea, the spans amount of time. This is probably 3, 4 years go by at least, if not longer than that. And we can kind of break down the remainder of the text if we do this. So we find three children. We can do one and two, and then the next one we'll get to in just a minute. So the first child begins here, and then you read kind of the same language three different times with each child. The Lord said to him, oops, I wanted this to be a highlighter. The Lord said to him, call his name. The Lord said to him, call her name, and the same thing down there, which we'll get to in a little bit. So God has a different name for each child, Jezreel, no mercy. And then each time there's an explanation given, for in just a little bit, for I will no more. Now, we don't know, just reading this, we don't know, this name Jezreel doesn't mean an awful lot to us unless you have a really good grasp of details in the Old Testament. So we're gonna single that out for something we want to study a little bit more. Jezreel obviously has some significance, and no doubt every person of the northern kingdom of Israel would have known exactly what Hosea was referring to, but for us, we're a little bit confused. But we get a sense here, and notice, so the house of Jehu, that was one of the kings of of Israel, and so something happened related to the house of Jehu, and the blood of Jezreel is on his hand, and so God is going to punish that. And then maybe the more ominous warning, I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. That's a warning that the northern kingdom is going to come to an end. Remember, I said there's two kingdoms. There's the northern, we call it Israel, and then the southern, sometimes called Judah. And that northern kingdom, God is saying that's coming to an end. So again, we have a little more homework to do. We don't know much about this valley of Jezreel. We want to know what happened there. And so that's going to take a little bit of digging. We'll probably have to look around in our Bibles and maybe a commentary or two to figure out exactly what happened there. But for now, we'll just notice that the first child has something to do with something that happened in this event at Jezreel. And because of whatever happened there, God is going to put an end to that northern kingdom. Let's look at the second son. We'll actually we'll look at we can look at the second and the third son kind of at the same time because they follow a similar pattern. So um, again, notice that the pattern is the same, right? She conceived, bore a daughter. The Lord said, "Call her name." She conceived, bore a son. The Lord said, "Call his name." So there's kind of that similar pattern, and that helps us break the text down and kind of see some structure here. But we get different names here. So the first name that we get is going to be No Mercy. Now, I don't know how you chose the names for your kids if you happen to have kids. You maybe name it after a family namesake, or you give it a name like, Grace, or you give it a name, that has some kind of nice meaning to it. And here's Hosea. He's given a name. Yeah, I want you to name your kid No Mercy. Um, I've known kids named Mercy, but I've never known a kid named No Mercy, and yet here we are. And again, there's that explanation given for I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel. In other words, the name of this first child is to represent God's the end of God's mercy. God had been withholding what his people had deserved, but that time is going to stop. By the way, this whole second section on the names of the kids tells us that there's a second motif here. God relates to his children as a husband-wife, but then there's also this parent-child relationship, and that too has been corrupted, as we're going to see. And so and that too is a theme that we find really throughout the whole book of Hosea. So God is not just a spouse, but he's also a parent. He desires to be both. And in this case, we find um, the first child is going to reflect God's intent to judge the house of Israel. Now, notice this a little bit later on. There's sort of a clause here in which God says, "But I will have mercy on the house of Judah." So, in other words, the northern kingdom is going to be judged, but God will spare that judgment from the house to the house of Judah. The southern kingdom will not be judged, and so we know that in the year 722 BC, the northern kingdom indeed did fall. And so that seems, by the way, to give us a little hint as to when this text was written. Um, we also know that in the year 586, so what is that, 150-ish years later, the southern kingdom also fell. And so their judgment was delayed. And so at this time, God says, I'm not going to judge the southern kingdom, but because things have gone a little bit better there over time, but I will judge the northern kingdom and then eventually the southern kingdom. So when she weaned no mercy, now she has another child, and here's again the names just keep getting better. Call my name, call his name, not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Um, this is a shocking statement because if you know your theology, Genesis 12, one of the things that God promised to Abraham and thus to Abraham and his children and grandchildren, all of his descendants, is he said, I will be your God and you will be my people. That was a covenant relationship that God had made to be the God to his people and to be faithful and to be a faithful parent to him. And now God is saying the terms of the covenant have been shattered and broken, and therefore I am no longer obligated under the terms of the covenant to continue to be your God. So that's a really harsh sentence that God is passing down. Now, let's go to the last portion of this text, and we're going to see that the text actually ends with the hint of promise, and that's actually rather important. So here, this word here, I would argue, is one of the most significant words in the text because it serves as sort of a not exactly a pivot point, but it's a word that still holds out hope for the people. So this terrible judgment is coming. The kingdom is going to be brought to an end. God is going to break. He's no longer obligated by the terms of the covenant because his people have broken the covenant. He's no longer going to show he's no longer going to show mercy to his people. But we find this language here and it's worth pointing out. Um, the language of sand along the sea The number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand on the sea. That too is Genesis language. That's the covenant that God makes with Abraham a little bit later in I think it's Genesis chapter 15, where God lays out that promise where he says, your descendants will be as many as the stars in the sky and the sands on the seashore. And so while God has come here earlier in the text, he has essentially said the covenant is broken by the people. He's coming back here and he's reaffirming it. He's reaffirming the covenant. He's saying, and yet there's still going to be a way, in spite of all of this judgment, there's still going to be a way where I will fulfill and keep the terms of the covenant. And again, down here, same thing. You shall be children of the living God, and they shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint one head, and they shall go up from the day, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Now, again, we still have our homework to do on what is Jezreel, but there's this text ends as sobering and stark as this all is. The text still ends with a great deal of promise. There's this idea that somehow God is going to bring his people back and he's going to restore them and he's going to reenact the covenant somehow. It's not said here how. We have to complete our homework again and find out how does that happen. But for now, we see that as sobering as this text is, there is that hope that still remains. So we still have some work ahead of us. We've gotten a little bit further along. We know a general sense of the text. It's a promise. It's a promise of judgment that God is going to carry out, and he's using the imagery of spousal relationship and parental relationship to show how sin has corrupted both of those desired relationships, and yet there is still this promise that God holds out that he's not finished with his people yet. There's more we're going to be able to say about this. I hope you'll join me. We're going to be looking at this text on September 7th. Here at Sunny Slope. And so I hope to see you then when we keep on exploring God's Word together. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Digging In.